In 1912, a ship hit an iceberg because one man forgot his keys. In 1986, 7 astronauts died because one memo was ignored. In 1815, the greatest military commander in history lost his final battle because he woke up 5 hours too late. These are not conspiracy theories. These are not myths. Every single one of these disasters was caused by something embarrassingly small, a forgotten object, an ignored warning, a decision that took 30 seconds, and cost millions of lives. History's greatest catastrophes were not inevitable. They were not acts of God. They were acts of human error, small, avoidable, and absolutely devastating. Today, we are looking at 5 of the most catastrophic blunders in history. 5 moments where one tiny mistake triggered a chain reaction that changed the world forever. And the most terrifying part? Every single one of them could have been prevented. It is April 1915. World War I has been grinding through the trenches of Europe for 8 months. Neither side is winning. Neither side is losing, just dying, slowly, in the mud, by the millions. British strategist Winston Churchill has an idea, a bold one. Instead of throwing more men into the Western Front meat grinder, why not attack the Ottoman Empire from the south? Take the Gallipoli Peninsula, control the Dardanelles Strait, open a sea route to Russia, knock the Ottomans out of the war entirely. On paper, it is brilliant. In execution, it becomes one of the worst military disasters in British history. Here is what happened. The Allied fleet attempts to force the strait in March and fails badly. The naval attack is abandoned, so now it falls to the ground forces. 75,000 troops are assembled. The landings are planned. The element of surprise is the only real advantage they have. And then they throw it away. The original plan calls for landing at dawn, darkness as cover, hit the beaches before the Ottomans can react. It is standard military logic, and it would almost certainly have worked. But the final orders are delayed. Paperwork, bureaucracy, communication failures between commanders who cannot agree on timing. The launch window slips hour by hour until dawn comes and goes. The Allied troops finally land in broad daylight at 9 in the morning, in full view of every Ottoman defensive position on the cliffs above them. The Ottomans, commanded by a brilliant young officer named Mustafa Kemal, the man who will one day become Ataturk, are waiting. They have had hours to prepare, hours that the Allies handed them for free. The slaughter on the beaches is immediate and catastrophic. Men cut down before they reach the sand. Officers shot before they leave the boats. 8 months of brutal fighting follows. And the Allies never break through. In December 1915, 8 months after the landing, the Allies evacuate. 58,000 Allied soldiers dead. 87,000 Ottoman soldiers dead. The Dardanelles never opened. Russia never received its supply route. The Ottoman Empire stayed in the war. All of it, every single death, traces back to one morning, one set of delayed orders, 5 hours of bureaucratic confusion that cost 145,000 lives. Winston Churchill, the man whose idea it was, is forced to resign. He spends years in political exile. The lesson of Gallipoli is not that the plan was wrong. The plan was sound. The lesson is that the gap between a good plan and its execution can be measured in bodies. In 1975, an engineer named Stephen Sasson walked into a meeting room at Eastman Kodak, the most powerful photography company on Earth, and showed his bosses something that had never existed before: a digital camera. It was the size of a toaster. It took 23 seconds to capture a single image. The image quality was terrible, but it worked. And Stephen Sasson knew, with absolute certainty, that he was holding the future of photography in his hands. His bosses looked at it. They discussed it. And then they made a decision that would eventually destroy the company that paid their salaries. They buried it. Here is what Kodak was in 1975. The company controlled 90% of film sales and 85% of camera sales in the United States. They were not just successful. They were untouchable. Photography meant Kodak. Kodak meant film. Film meant money. Billions of dollars of it every single year. And that was exactly the problem. Kodak's leadership looked at Sassoon's digital camera and saw one thing very clearly: a machine that would make film obsolete. Their film, their profits, their entire business model. If digital photography succeeded, Kodak's most profitable product would become worthless overnight. So they classified the invention. They locked it away. They told Sassoon to keep quiet about it. The digital camera was not killed because it didn't work. It was killed because it worked too well. For 20 years, Kodak sat on the technology. Competitors slowly caught up. Japan's camera manufacturers began developing their own digital systems. The technology improved, the prices dropped, and the public slowly began to realize they didn't need film anymore. By 2000, digital cameras were everywhere. By 2004, digital photos outnumbered film photos globally for the first time in history. By 2012, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. The company that invented digital photography went bankrupt because of digital photography. Let that sink in. Kodak didn't fail because they lacked innovation. They had the innovation first. They failed because they were so afraid of disrupting their own profits that they handed the future to their competitors for free. And here is the most devastating detail of all. At their peak, Kodak employed 145,000 people worldwide. By the time they filed for bankruptcy, that number had fallen to 17,000. One decision, made in a conference room in 1975. 128,000 jobs gone. By the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte had conquered most of Europe. France controlled territory from Spain to the borders of Russia. His Grande Armée, the greatest military force ever assembled in the history of the world, had never lost a major campaign. He was, by any measure, untouchable. And then he decided to invade Russia. The plan was not as reckless as it sounds. Napoleon's strategy was simple and historically proven. March fast, force a decisive battle early, destroy the Russian army before winter, and return home victorious before the cold set in. He had done this before. It had always worked. There was just one problem. He left 5 weeks late. The original invasion date was set for mid-May 1812. That timing was not arbitrary. It was calculated precisely to give the Grande Armée enough campaigning season to force a battle, win, and withdraw before the Russian winter made operations impossible. But the launch kept being delayed. Diplomatic negotiations that went nowhere. Supply logistics that weren't ready. Political discussions that dragged on. Week after week, the departure date slipped. Mid-May became June. June became June 24th. 5 weeks, that was all. On June 24th, 1812, Napoleon crossed the Niemen River into Russia with 685,000 men, the largest invasion force in history to that point. The Russian army retreated rather than fight. They burned crops, destroyed supplies, and pulled Napoleon deeper and deeper into their territory. Napoleon pushed forward, expecting the decisive battle that never came. Moscow fell in September, but the Tsar refused to surrender. Napoleon waited in Moscow for 5 weeks, expecting a peace offer that never arrived. He finally began his retreat on October 19th, 6 weeks too late. The Russian winter arrived in full force. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Men froze to death in their thousands. Supply lines collapsed. Horses died faster than they could be replaced. Of the 685,000 men who crossed into Russia in June, fewer than 100,000 returned. Napoleon lost more men in the Russian campaign than any general in history had lost in a single war. And the reason traces back to one decision. Not the invasion itself. Not the strategy. Not even the weather. 5 weeks. A late start on a campaign where timing was everything. 585,000 men paid for those 5 weeks with their lives. On the night of April 14th, 1912, the RMS Titanic was sailing at nearly full speed through the North Atlantic. The ship was 4 days into its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. The weather was clear. The ocean was unusually calm. And somewhere ahead in the darkness, an iceberg was waiting. At 11:40 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spotted the iceberg from the crow's nest and rang the warning bell. The ship turned, but it was too late. The Titanic struck the iceberg at an angle and began to sink. 1,517 people died that night. And it might never have happened if one man hadn't forgotten his keys. Here is what most people don't know about the Titanic disaster. The lookouts in the crow's nest had no binoculars. Not because binoculars didn't exist. Not because the ship didn't have them. The Titanic had a perfectly good pair of binoculars, locked in a storage cabinet in the officers' quarters. The key to that cabinet belonged to Second Officer David Blair. Blair had been assigned to the Titanic during its construction and fitting out. He knew the ship inside and out. He knew exactly where the binoculars were stored and what they were for. But 10 days before the Titanic left Southampton, Blair was reassigned, transferred off the ship at the last minute to make room for a more senior officer. In the rush and confusion of the transfer, Blair walked off the Titanic with the key to the binoculars cabinet still in his pocket. Nobody noticed. Nobody asked. And nobody found a replacement key before the ship sailed. Frederick Fleet, the lookout who first spotted the iceberg, later testified at the inquiry into the disaster. He was asked directly, "If you had binoculars that night, would you have seen the iceberg sooner?" His answer was simple. Yes, enough time to avoid it. The binoculars were later found locked in the cabinet, right where Blair had left them. The key was found in Blair's possession after the disaster. He kept it for the rest of his life, reportedly never fully coming to terms with what his forgotten key had cost. One transfer, one key left in one pocket, 1,517 lives. The Titanic didn't sink because it was unsinkable. It sank because the man who could have prevented it was already on his way home, with the wrong thing in his pocket. On January 28, 1986, at 11:38 in the morning, the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 73 seconds later, it was gone. 7 astronauts died. Among them, Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher from New Hampshire, who had been selected from over 11,000 applicants to be the first civilian in space. Millions of school children across America were watching live. Their teacher was on that shuttle. The explosion shocked the world. But what came out in the investigation that followed shocked it even more. NASA knew. Not about the explosion specifically, but they knew there was a serious problem. They had known for months, and the night before the launch, the engineers who understood that problem best stood in a room and begged NASA not to fly. Here is what they knew. The space shuttle's solid rocket boosters were sealed with rubber O-rings, circular gaskets that prevented hot gases from escaping through the joints. The O-rings had a critical flaw. In cold temperatures, and they became less flexible. Less flexible meant less effective. Less effective meant hot gases could leak through. And hot gases leaking through meant catastrophic failure. Engineers at Morton Thiokol the company that manufactured the booster rockets, had been raising this concern for over a year. They had written memos. They had sent warnings. They had flagged the issue in multiple reports, all of it documented, all of it on record. The night before launch, January 27, 1986, the temperature at Kennedy Space Center was forecast to drop to -1 degree Celsius overnight, the coldest launch conditions in shuttle history. Roger Boisjoli, the lead engineer who understood the O-ring problem better than anyone, presented the data clearly and urgently in a teleconference with NASA management. His conclusion was unambiguous. Do not launch tomorrow. The O-rings will fail. NASA management listened, then asked Morton Thiokol management to take a vote, without the engineers in the room. The managers voted to launch. The next morning, January 28th, the temperature at Kennedy Space Center was -2 degrees Celsius, the coldest launch in shuttle history. At 73 seconds, the right solid rocket booster failed at the O-ring joint. Hot gases leaked through. The external fuel tank exploded. The Challenger broke apart at an altitude of 46,000 feet. Roger Boisjoli watched it happen on a television screen in a conference room. He had predicted it exactly. Nobody had listened. He spent the rest of his life speaking publicly about the disaster, not out of bitterness, but because he believed that the lesson of Challenger was not a technical one. It was a human one. When the people who know say stop, you stop. 5 stories, 5 disasters, 5 moments where the course of history turned on something embarrassingly small. A bureaucratic delay that cost 5 weeks and 500,000 lives. A corporate decision made in a conference room in 1975 that destroyed a company employing 145,000 people. A military order that arrived 5 hours too late and sent 250,000 men to their deaths on a beach they should never have needed to storm. A key left in the wrong pocket. And 1,517 people who never made it home. A memo ignored on a cold January night, and 7 people who never came back from 46,000 feet. None of these were inevitable. Every single one had a moment, one clear, specific, identifiable moment where a different choice would have changed everything. That is the lesson that history keeps trying to teach us. Not that disasters are random, not that catastrophe is fate, but that the gap between what happens and what could have happened is almost always filled with one human decision. One delay, one ignored warning, one forgotten key. The question history keeps asking is simple. Are you listening? Because the engineers always know. The warnings are always written. The key is always in someone's pocket. The only question is whether anyone is paying attention. If you want more stories like these, subscribe. Because next time, we go even deeper. I will see you in the next one.